Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. We will get started in another few minutes. I see that we still have a bunch of people jumping on, and we've got folks from all over the world. Sabrina, I see your note about Washington, the Sunshine State. I'm right there with you this morning. I say we're in the better Washington, but some folks may disagree with that. Camp Lejeune, I've seen a number of folks jump on from California, Alaska. Thanks so much for joining us, San Diego, Moody Air Force Base, Fayetteville, wonderful. New York. Fort Bragg, love it. Bunch of folks out in San Diego, Jacksonville. Thanks everyone for joining us. This is great. Walter Reed, Honolulu, wonderful. The five-sided building, I'm glad you could get on. We never know how the comms will be. Millington, great. National Guard, wonderful. Orlando. Grand Forks Air Force Base, nice, welcome. Norfolk, welcome. Fort Drum. So I saw somebody noted something about a microphone. Most likely folks have been muted, and we'll probably turn off chat once we get started. I ask that as we go through this session, if anybody has questions, please enter them in the Q&A box. So there's a little button in Zoom that you can click to enter your questions there. And we do that just to streamline things and make it easier to track. No, we cannot hear your dog, Charlotte. No worries. Buckley Space Force Base, wonderful. Thank you for joining us. Germany, awesome. Awesome. We've got folks from all over the world. This is exciting. Okay, well, without further ado, I'll go ahead and get started. Thank you so much to everyone who is joining us today. We are really excited to have you here. I know we've got folks from all over the world calling in and really calling in at all hours. So we really appreciate it. We have an amazing session for you today. I'm Jessica Gallus. I'm the Department of the Navy Office of Force Resiliency Senior Advisor on Violence Prevention. So our portfolio includes suicide prevention, sexual harassment and sexual assault prevention and response. And what we're going to be talking about today is mental health. We often we talk about a lot now that mental health is health. And one of the things that I think we sometimes forget to do is focus on our mental health in the same way that we focus on our physical health. So thinking about the idea that you wouldn't wait until you were diabetic, or you wouldn't wait until you had a broken limb to see a doctor, or to proactively address your physical health. What do we need to do to proactively address our mental health? And part of the reason I'm really excited to have Major General Retired Martin with us today is it's very rare for senior leaders to share their mental health journeys, even though so many of us at some point in our lives experience some kind of hardship or some kind of experience that really causes us to have to take a step back. And so we are beyond excited to have General Martin here with us today. And I'll provide a little bit of background on him, and then we'll get started. And really, this is going to be a fireside chat. So it's really going to be a dialogue between General Martin and myself about his journey with mental health and specifically bipolar disorder. If this is your first time tuning in to our Standing Watch webinar series, just to give a little bit of background, we started this during COVID to support our naval forces in building the leadership and resilience skills needed for high performance and readiness, and essentially gain traction with the other services. And we're just excited to offer something that's of value to the field. Along those lines, we will have a survey. We will have a survey link that we'll post at the end, or you'll get a survey link via email. I'd encourage everybody to complete that if possible, just so that we can ensure we're still providing valuable sessions for the field. So we want your ideas. We want to know what kind of impact we're having. Again, for anybody who's got questions, if you could put those in the Q&A box. Please give us a few weeks. Please give us 2 weeks to process any continuing education credits. So when you registered, you had to input that information. If you were looking for those credits, we will not forget about you. We will get it. No need to add anything to the chat or the Q&A. Just give us a little bit of time to process that. We are a small but mighty team, as I like to say. So without further ado, I want to get started in introducing Major General retired Gregg Martin. We are so honored to have him here with us today. He served on active duty for 36 years until May 2015. He's a combat veteran, bipolar survivor, airborne ranger, engineer, qualified soldier, and Army strategist. He has a PhD and 2 master's degrees from MIT, master's degrees in national security strategy from both the Army and Naval War Colleges, and a bachelor's degree from West Point, where he was commissioned. He's held a number of leadership positions, and this is not going to do him justice by any means. So I hope General Martin will share a little bit more of his background when we start talking. But he was the commandant of the Army Engineer School. He commanded Fort Leonard Wood. He was the deputy commanding general of the 3rd Army, or U.S. Army Central. He was the commandant of the Army War College and also president of the National Defense University. So without further ado, I want to welcome General Martin to the session and look forward to getting everyone's questions. We'll talk back and forth for the next 45 minutes or so, and then we'll open to questions. So again, put those in the Q&A box if you can. So welcome, General Martin. Thanks so much for being here with us today.
Oh, thanks, Jessica. I really appreciate the invite. It's a great honor and a privilege to be with you, the Department of the Navy, and then all the joint force that's out there that I saw dial in. Also, thanks to Priscilla for setting the technology up to do this. But it's really an honor and a privilege to be with you all.
Thanks so much, sir. So I will jump right in. And, in the military, we like to start with the bluff or the bottom line up front. And so I wanted to get a sense of what's the bluff for your story with your journey on bipolar and so much of what you've traversed over the last few years. Can you give us the bottom line?
Yes, it's that mental illness and bipolar disorder can strike and afflict anybody. It doesn't matter your age, your rank, your income, your race, your gender, it doesn't matter. It can strike anybody and take you down. And the really bad news is that left untreated, what bipolar disorder and mental illness can do is, ruin your life, ruin your marriage, your family, your career, end up with addictions, end up homeless, in prison, and dead. That's the bad news. The good news is that with medical treatment, if you go get help and work on your own recovery, you can live a happy, healthy, purposeful life like I'm doing right now. And if you think, hey, it's not going to hit me, consider these statistics. 20% of the global population right now is afflicted with some type of mental illness, 20%. And the other 80% are affected by it, either as a caregiver, a family member, a friend, a work colleague. So that's 20 plus 80 is 100% of the global population are somehow afflicted and or affected by mental illness. So it could hit any one of you.
That is really critical. And I think what's so compelling about your story is the leadership positions you were in when some of the bipolar disorder impacted your life. And we'll get to that. But I think there's so few folks who are willing to talk about this, particularly in a military context. So just really appreciative of you sharing your story today. I understand that you do have some strong connections with the Navy. So I think your dad, 2 uncles, you've got a number of service members in your family. Is that right?
Yeah, quite a bit of military service in our family. And then as far as the Navy goes, also I'm a graduate of the Naval War College.
Right.
And my forthcoming book, which will be out in September, it was published by the Naval Institute Press and sponsored by the Association of the U.S. Army. But so it's a real joint effort.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much. Um, and in terms of the background for how the bipolar disorder came about, are there signs that you had growing up, in high school, in college, any early indicators that maybe there was something there?
So no clear indicators of bipolar disorder at
Okay.
all until 2014 when I was 58 years old, when, basically I was forced to resign from my job. Shortly thereafter, I crashed into depression, was hospitalized, etc. But looking back from now to the beginning of, early days of my life, there were definitely indicators of a sort of a inching upwards towards bipolar disorder, and then the onset during combat during the Iraq War. And so as a young person, I had excessive energy, drive, enthusiasm, creativity, problem solving skills. And so did extremely well, like A plus in, as a student, athlete, leader, all the way through, got to go to West Point, same thing there. And then as a junior Army officer, same thing, tremendous energy, did extremely well. And what I didn't realize until about a year or two ago is that I actually had a condition called hyperthymia, or a
Mhm.
hyperthymic personality. Now, that is not a mental illness, it's a personality type, but it's an abnormal type where you have a virtually continuous low level mild mania, which is what gave me all that extra energy and drive. And so you can have a hyperthymic personality and never get bipolar disorder, or you can get bipolar disorder and never had hyperthymia.
Got it.
So, but in my case, the hyperthymia led to a greater probability of coming down with bipolar disorder. And so over the years, during my 20s, 30s, 40s, into my 50s, that my levels of mania kept growing and growing, getting higher and higher. And they helped me for a really long time to perform better until it went too high. And then both the VA and the Department of the Army, they came to the conclusion that the actual onset of my bipolar disorder was in 2003 during the Iraq War, when I was a brigade commander in charge of thousands of troops. And, the thrill, the euphoria, the adrenaline, the stress of combat, it actually triggered my genetic predisposition for bipolar disorder. And then the bipolar disorder, mainly, it was mostly mania for about the first 11 years. It was undetected, unknown, undiagnosed. And it kept getting higher levels of mania, lower levels of depression until by 2014, so 11 years later, I went into full blown mania where I was essentially in a state of madness, insane,
Mm.
over the top, erratic, out of control. And so my boss at the time was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And he made a decision that he needed to pull me out of command and get me medical help, which was the best thing that he could have done. So he was a good boss who was looking out for his mission, his organization, but also for me, my health, my family. So to recap your question, were there signs? Looking back now, yes, there were clearly signs in my 30s and 40s of increasingly wild, over the top, what you could really call kind of crazy behavior, even prior to my bipolar onset in Iraq. So the signs were there, but nobody knew what they were looking at because the force, all the people that were around me were untrained in what the symptoms of mental illness, and in particular bipolar, looked like. And so the signs were there.
Mhm.
People saw it, but they didn't know what it was they were seeing. So it just went undetected for that whole time.
Got it. Got it. And you talked, General Martin, about increasing signs of mania. So like a heightening of the mania that you experienced. What um this may be an ignorant question, but was it that you just had more and more energy? Like I could see, in a profession where sometimes you were asked to constantly respond and to respond quickly, that people would just say, wow, this person is really a good performer, and they get back very quickly. And or were there other things that maybe indicated something's not quite right here?
So some of the things, obviously, mania drives energy way up. So excessive energy, the need for very little sleep. So even before the bipolar disorder onset, I was getting by with 4 hours of sleep a night. But when I went into full mania, I went weeks, months with virtually no sleep at all.
Wow.
I started talking faster and faster with what they call forced or pressured speech. Like I just couldn't talk fast enough. And I would jump from idea to idea rapidly. I would lose track of the time. I would be late often. I couldn't stay on track. I stopped doing paperwork because I just thought it was boring, and it wasn't, basically leveraging what I considered extreme intellect. I mean, I thought I was the smartest guy in the world, thought I had the
Right.
key to world peace. I started becoming extremely over the top religious, which is one of the keys. Started spending money, pretty recklessly. And basically went out of control. And anybody who didn't agree with me and didn't share my vision for how to transform and lead the organization into the future, I thought were against me, that they were the enemy, that they were out to sabotage, this transformation effort. And then my paranoia grew so bad that I actually began to believe, and this is called delusions or psychosis. I started believing that many in my workforce were, they were videotaping, watching me all the time, out to get me arrested, put in jail, get me killed. And I really, truly believe that. I
Wow.
started having hallucinations of seeing the Holy Spirit come down from heaven, and many, many other things that I could talk about. And those examples that I just gave in the last minute or so, those are examples from when I was really manic, full blown mania, and just scale those back a little bit to lesser levels of the things that I just said. And that was the glide path towards full mania. On the depressive side of things, I basically became withdrawn, quiet. I went from being an extrovert to an introvert, became very indecisive, had a hard time making decisions, didn't want to be around people, just wanted to stay in my office. And so I became a completely different person when I was
Wow.
depressed than I was when I was manic. And so those are some of the symptoms. And what I've done is I've actually taken those symptoms and given them down. I live in Cocoa Beach, Florida, and I've given them to my close friends and said, "Hey, if I have bipolar disorder. Here are some of the symptoms of both mania, depression, psychosis, and if you see me drifting into or starting to, live evidence some of these symptoms, talk to me, talk to my wife Maggie, because I probably am at a point where I need help or some corrective course of action."
I love that. I love that you gave that list to help people recognize and intervene if necessary. Because I think a lot of times people have great intentions and want to help, but don't always know what the signs are, or, is this person at a point where they may need help? So I think that's really critical. How I'm seeing a number of questions come through on the chat, and I know you talked about this some when you were in full mania, but before that, how did the mania impact your leadership ability? So before you got to that point where you were, delusional or had psychosis, what were there signs that you think people could have picked up on that maybe something wasn't right?
Uh, Low-level mania, like the hyperthymia that I described earlier, and even when I was in by actual bipolar disorder, in a state of bipolar disorder, it basically is a performance enhancement. You can think of it as a performance enhancing drug because it's being caused by excessive positive biochemicals in the brain, like dopamine, like endorphins, and several others. And so what it does is your brain produces more of these than is normal, and it elevates your performance. So while I was moving into more and more mania and bipolar disorder, my performance boosted. It went up, up, up. And
Right.
so even though, yes, there was something going on that wasn't quite right in my brain, it was masked by an increased level of performance. So
Oh,
one of the real tricks about bipolar disorder is essentially it helps you until it doesn't help you anymore. And it
got
helps you, at the low level as you're going up, but then there's a certain point where it gets too high, where you go into, a state of madness, and you become out of control, or your depressions get so bad that you can't function. And when that happens, you need to go get medical help for sure. And at that point, people can recognize that there's really something wrong. And I was fortunate, my boss, the chairman, he clearly was able to see it, pull me out of a high pressure job, and get me medical help.
wow. Wow. So would you say that that explains how you could go 11 years? Because I know you said that you think that kind of the gene that you have, the predisposition for bipolar was turned on during your time leading troops in combat in Iraq in 2003, but then the bipolar really didn't emerge or come full circle until 2014. So as somebody who's not savvy on bipolar, I would say, well, how could you go 11 years without people knowing that this was an issue? But maybe do you think that's because of the performance enhancing aspects that you were speaking about?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is that it was a performance enhancement. And so I was doing really well, getting promoted. I got promoted from colonel to 1-star to 2-star. I went from one big job to another job to another job, and I was working for, 4-star generals along the way. So that was one factor. The second factor is even if people around me said, hey, there's something wrong with this guy, I'm not sure what it is. It's very difficult for a subordinate to go into the boss, especially, a general, a 2-star, and say, hey, general, I've been noticing some behavior lately that leads me to believe that you may have some kind of mental illness. I mean, that's really
Right.
hard. And I think that would be expecting too much from someone of a lower rank. But what we should have had, and we should have it all through the military and the corporate world and the government world, we should have safe channels. So, for example, when I was president of National Defense University, I had 3 generals, 1-stars, working directly for me. I had several SESs working for me and an ambassador. So any one of those people of that high of a rank should have had the confidence to come in and talk to me. So what should happen is a lower ranking subordinate should be able to go laterally, like to the ambassador. I couldn't do anything to an ambassador. Let's say I got really mad that the
Oh,
ambassador,
I see.
I have a mental illness. I couldn't have done anything to her anyway. She's an ambassador. I have
Right.
no ability to discipline, punish, hurt her career. But
Right.
that and people didn't go laterally. And then the people who were just one step below me, they didn't come in and talk to me, which if they
Mm,
recognized it was a problem, they should have. The next thing that goes on is, you know, I had been doing very well as a leader. And so many, if not most of my subordinates, they really liked me. And they thought it was fun working for Martin because it's exciting and we're doing big things. And this guy's kind of a wild man and he always makes us laugh. And it's a blast. We love working here. We could get
right.
some don't like at all. And so they didn't want to lose me and they didn't want to hurt me because they liked me. And so I think it was all of those factors together worked to let me continue to go into what became severe, life-threatening bipolar disorder.
It raises really interesting questions about, how do we in the military, in civilian life support leaders who are struggling with mental health challenges? And I can see, especially as a general officer, who wants to go to the general and say, hey, sir, we think you're struggling with X, Y, and Z. I could see how that would be really tough for people. Um, do you think there's a way your team could have framed it so that you could have heard it? Or is it too hard to say if you would have just dismissed it? Hey, everything's fine, everything's great.
I think by the time people recognized that there really was a problem with me, I was so far up the trajectory of mania that I would not have believed them. I would have disregarded it. I would have thought through my paranoia that they were
Right.
out to hurt me. The way I think you can really make a long-term difference is in changing the culture of the military, corporations, government, et cetera. And you start by doing things like you're doing right now, having forums and open sessions about mental health, suicide prevention, so that it becomes normalized and it's in talking about it is an accepted part of the organizational culture. It's not a taboo, stigmatized subject. People should understand that mental illness is they are chronic diseases very similar to diabetes, cancer, heart
Yeah.
disease. It's not that, you don't get bipolar disorder because you're not trying hard enough or you lack character or you lack willpower. I mean, I have all the willpower in the world, but it didn't stop the physiological reaction inside my brain circuitry that threw me into a state of bipolar disorder. And so I think teaching, educating, making mental health resources available all the way down to the lower levels and having conversations. And, I'm sure, hopefully there's some flag officers and some senior NCOs that are on this thing. I mean, I think it's been, near the end of my career in 2015, more and more high-ranking officers and high-ranking NCOs started coming forward and saying, hey, I have been suffering from PTSD. And
Right.
PTSD is not a mental illness, but the symptoms are very much like some of our most serious mental illnesses. But I mean, those guys, they got treated, they got help, they got medication, and they continued to serve on active duty. I think there are people that are suffering from depression that are able to come out and say, hey, I've got, really bad depression. They can take medication, get diagnosed, continue to serve. And so I think the more we normalize it, talk about it, and push the mental health resources down to the lower levels,
Right.
and understand that shouldn't be stigmatized. If anything, we should look at people who are fighting and overcoming depression, bipolar disorder, other mental illness. We should look at them as heroic figures, similar to women who are fighting and battling against breast cancer, for example.
Right. Right.
And so the NFL, if you go back 50 years, breast cancer was a stigmatized, taboo subject. And First
Huh.
Lady Betty Ford, she was the first one that came out and said, hey, I have breast cancer. Here's the facts. Here's what we're doing. And 50 years later, I mean, it's really celebrated. Like, look at the NFL pro football players. They wear pink shoes and pink shoelaces and,
Right.
pink hats to celebrate the heroism and the courage of all those women who are fighting breast cancer. Mental illness should be seen the same way.
I love that. And your one of your very first points about no one is immune, that just, it resonates so much. I think so many have struggled, and when you've gone through some kind of mental health crisis, or you're dealing regularly with mental health illness, I think it can feel very isolating, and there can be a lot of shame But for those who come out on the other side, such as yourself, to be able to talk about it helps you, I think, get rid of some of that shame. And if anything, promote other folks to talk about it. If we can have general officers talk about it, then there's really, not a lot of folks who maybe would be afraid to talk about it.
Right. And, you talked about the shame, and I know a lot of people do suffer from the shame and the stigma and the self-stigma.
Right.
I was really fortunate that I didn't. And, my ego and sense of self and all the stuff that I had done and the person I was, I just said, I realized once I went from extreme mania and, lost my job and was forced to retire. And then I went into terrible depression. I mean, just crazy. The depression was just so hopeless and dark. Then all I wanted to do was die. And I started having suicidal ideations. I said, this is not me.
Right.
This is not Greg Martin. There is something
Right.
physically wrong inside my brain because I've never had anything like this. And I went to the doctor and I said, hey, after I was misdiagnosed 3 times, I went in July of 2014. I went to Walter Reed, and 3 times the doctors evaluated me and said, clean bill of health, fit for duty, nothing wrong. They completely missed the bipolar disorder. And then that reinforced the paranoia that people were really trying to get rid of me.
Oh, wow.
See, there's nothing wrong with me. And I got fired. That's because all these bad people were my enemies. But then I crashed into depression over the next couple months. And the depression was so bad, I went in as a walk-in to Walter Reed and said, I need help. I don't know what's wrong with me.
Wow.
Not the same person I was. And then they evaluated me and they were able pretty quickly to diagnose bipolar disorder
Huh.
type 1 with psychotic features. And once they told me, I gave the doctor a hug and said, hey, thanks, doctor. Now I know scientifically what's wrong with me. I need you to help me get better. And I just, I told people openly and started telling my story, and the rest
Wow.
is
Right, right. It must have been such a relief to get some kind of diagnosis to know, hey,
it,
there is something legitimately wrong here.
it was a huge relief. And I started really doing research on bipolar disorder. What is it? What causes it? How do you get better? What, et cetera. And
Right.
then I worked as hard as I could, given the depth of my depression, which saps all your energy, all your hope, all your willpower.
Yes.
I worked hard at it. I ended up getting hospitalized in the VA. That was a really positive step. I started confronting the sources of my psychosis, these paranoid delusions, and that really took willpower. And then finally, after 2 years, dozens of different medications, they finally got me on the right medication that worked for me, which it's principally lithium, which is a
Wow.
natural salt. And it really worked wonders. Within a week of starting on lithium, my depression went away. My psychosis pretty much went away. I haven't had any mania. There are some down to it, like they have to monitor the blood level of the lithium to protect your kidneys, your liver. I lost some balance and coordination, but overall it worked pretty well, along with a couple other medications I take. But once I got on the right medication, then I turned a corner and started my journey of recovery, which is really a lifelong journey. It never ends. And we can talk about that.
Great, great. You mentioned that you had been, I don't know if it was to Walter Reed, but you were essentially given a clean bill of health 3 times in a row. Can you talk a little bit more about that process and what you think led to that, if anything? Were you just not, I think it's hard sometimes for high performers to be seen as having any kind of psychological or mental health challenge if you're still performing well, and maybe by that point you were not. But how did that experience go, and what do you think were the challenges in terms of them missing your diagnosis?
So spring, summer of 2014 at National Defense University, my mania I rocketed off into space. I mean, I had hallucinations that I could fly, um, you know, key to world peace, et cetera. A lot of the things I already mentioned. And so then people started saying there's something wrong with this guy, and dozens, probably over 100 anonymous complaints and reports on me were sent to the Pentagon to chairman saying, we think General Martin has some sort of mental illness and there's something wrong with him. Here are some things that he's doing. And so I got wind of all that, and the chairman launched a series of what he called assessments, or evaluations, investigations to see what's going on at NDU. Like he interviewed all the students, then all the faculty, then looked at the curriculum, then looked directly at my leadership. And so I knew all this was going on. And my doctor at NDU, we had a health officer, or a doctor who oversaw the health of the students and the faculty, et cetera, came and talked to me and said, hey, all these reports about you are going in. I know there's nothing wrong with you. This is my doctor. Said, there's nothing wrong with you. Here's an idea. Why don't you go in voluntarily to Walter Reed and get a psychiatric examination? You'll come out clean, and then you can send that report up the chain of command, and they'll see that there's nothing wrong with you. So I said, oh, that's a great idea. So I did. I went over, and two doctors examined me, and they both said, there's nothing wrong with you. You're fine. No, they didn't see anything wrong. And they said, you seem like you're stressed out, but you have a hard job and you have this big mission to transform NDU. And so they basically didn't know what was wrong. They saw nothing. And so I took that report that said fit for duty, and I sent it up the chain of command to the chairman, and I CC'd, everybody. And, on the Army staff, the Joint staff,
right.
Look, there's nothing wrong with me. I'm okay.
Fine.
And so they took it, and my boss took it and sent it back and said, get another evaluation. And so I got another one with different doctors this time, and they said the same thing. They said, clean bill, nothing wrong. At that second one, and this was all before I got fired, at the second one, I brought my wife with me, and they asked her, they said, do you see anything? She said, well, I'm seeing some, really some strange behavior. He's doing these things, and it seems like it might be manic. And they wrote that down, possible mania, but they sent me back to work. And so, but then what happened is the chairman decided to pull me out of command, to remove me. And then he gave me a command order, go back and get a third evaluation, which I did after I got fired. And I went in, and the same thing, clean bill of health. So what happened? Why did these doctors get it so wrong? Well, a couple things. Number one, breakdown in communication. The doctors never got all the reports to look at that my chain of command had seen. So the chairman and the joint staff had seen dozens and dozens of reports of how crazy I had gone. They never sent them to the doctors, and the doctors never asked for them. So they were essentially operating in the dark. If they had looked at those reports that had come in from the people that were around me, I'm sure they would have diagnosed me probably in, 5 minutes. They would have diagnosed me and said bipolar disorder, but they didn't. So the doctors failed to get the information that was readily available, and the chain of command failed because they didn't send what they had and knew over to the doctors. So that's the biggest reason of the breakdown. The second big thing is doctors in the military, they would have diagnosed me probably a lot quicker if I'd have been an 18 to 25-year-old,
Great.
sailor, airman, maybe a lieutenant, a young NCO, because bipolar disorder typically strikes between 18 and 25. And here I was, 58 years old, plus a general, plus a long record. And they were not, it didn't fit their model for what they saw for mental illness. And they didn't want to hurt me. They didn't want to do that. And this is a thing that we call VIP medicine, for very important person medicine. A lot of times, someone who is a high level ranking executive, military, government, whatever, movie star, actor, whatever, musician, when they go to get medical help, the doctors try to be nice to them. They don't want to hurt them. And so they treat them very gently, and they don't give them the same treatment they would give to any normal lower ranking person. And so in my case, they treated me nice so as not to hurt me, but in so doing, they deprived me of the medication I really needed, lithium.
Mhm.
I probably really needed to go inpatient at Walter Reed and, be in
Right.
a fine facility for a couple of weeks getting inpatient multidisciplinary treatment. They didn't do that. And so in being, quote unquote, nice to me and not wanting to hurt me, they actually harmed me.
Right, right. And it sounds like your command had a number of signs. It sounds like they were those formal complaints that were submitted, or it was people just kind of sending or talking with the chairman saying, hey, there's something going on here.
Both. He was getting
Oh,
input, verbally on email,
wow.
written letters. I mean, probably over 100. And these are coming in from lots of the students, the faculty, the staff. So we're talking, you know, O5s, O6s, O7s, SESs, ambassadors, et cetera. So from, even some of the international fellows from other countries, they wrote letters too.
Wow.
I was
Okay.
in I was in really bad shape. If that mania had continued at its trajectory, I probably would have ended up in jail or dead.
Wow. And one of the questions we had here is about, we're getting a ton of questions, so keep them coming, everybody. This is awesome. Uh, one of the questions was about how the chairman approached you to essentially ask you to step down. And to the extent that you're comfortable, could you share what that conversation looked like? Because I think, a lot of us struggle with, how do we have this really tough conversation with somebody who we want to help, but is, maybe wreaking havoc because of some mental health challenges.
Yeah, it's a great story. I don't know if anybody in the audience knows General Martin Dempsey, who was the chairman from 2011 to 2015. So I met him when I was a lieutenant colonel back in 1997. I was one of his battalion commanders when he commanded the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment out in Colorado. So I worked for him as a lieutenant colonel and he was a colonel. And then I worked for him 3 more times when he was a 4-star. And plus, we were adjacent commanders and staff officers in both Germany and in Iraq. So I had years of experience working with him. He was a great guy. I mean, happy, cheerful, fun to be around, funny, great, great boss, great leader, smart as a whip. And so he had handpicked me for 3 big jobs: commander of Fort Leonard Wood, commandant of the Army War College, and then president of National Defense University. I mean, he handpicked me, put me in there, and gave me the mission to transform the organization. So it was very confusing and troubling to him when he started getting these reports, because he was a mentor, a friend, and we got
Right.
along. So after things really got insane, it was a Friday afternoon. I got a message. The chairman wants you to report to his office 10 o'clock Monday morning over in the Pentagon. And so I said, oh, wow. So here's what's going to happen. He's either going to promote me, tell me what a great job I'm doing, and I'll get extended, or because I knew about all these bad reports, he might fire me. And so I went over and he said, and I encourage you to bring Maggie, my wife. And I
Mhm.
think a little odd. And but he knew Maggie, and they got along great. So maybe he wanted her there when he gave me the great news. So anyway, I went over to the Pentagon and was in the little waiting room, and I noticed that people weren't as friendly as they normally were. Because usually,
Oh,
like when
wow.
you're sitting outside the chairman's office, people stop by, they say
Right.
hi, ask you how you're
Right.
doing, they joke around. It's very
Right.
pleasant, and people knew that I was kind of a Dempsey acolyte mentee.
Right.
I noticed nobody was saying hello, and I said, "Oh, that's kind of weird." And then I got the word, hey, report in. So I knock on the door, open it up, report in, salute. And General Dempsey, the first thing I see is his lawyer is in the room. I said, oh, this is not a good sign to have the lawyer there. So General Dempsey walks across the room. He gives me a great big bear hug. And he said, Greg, I love you like a brother. You have
Oh,
done an amazing job. I give you an A+ for your job performance. In just 2 years, you've taken the ball from the end zone and moved it all the way to the red zone. And I know you could go in for a touchdown, but I need a new quarterback. So your time at NDU is over. You have until 5 p.m. today to either resign voluntarily or I fire you.
wow.
And,
What?
and,
What? Yeah.
and then he said, and by the way, I'm ordering you to go get a mental health evaluation at Walter Reed.
Wow. Wow. What immediately strikes me about the way he did it is that even though he was firing you, he did it with compassion.
Right. I mean, Dempsey, stand-up guy. He did it himself in
Right.
person.
Right.
He didn't delegate it, to somebody else to do the dirty.
Right.
He treated me the same way he always treated me. He didn't treat me in that action. He didn't treat me any different than he
Right.
did like battalion commander. And he told me, he said, you did an unbelievable job. Like nobody could have moved the needle the way you did.
Right.
And then he went on. We continued the dialogue. He said, I see what's going on. You've got a rebellion on your hand. People have lost a lot of confidence in you. He said, you're at a point now where you cannot win this fight. He said, I've seen it with other generals and admirals where they get in a situation where their workforce have turned on them, and they go to there's media leaks and bad stories, and
Right.
there's IG complaints. And he said they basically will tie you in knots and stab you to death, like in Gulliver's Travels, how they get the giant.
Right.
They
Right.
and he said that's what's going to happen to you. So I'm doing you a
Wow.
huge favor of getting you out of there. And the other thing, he did me a huge favor by not firing me. He didn't give me a relief for cause, because
Okay.
it's in terms of the law and legalities and in military administration, if you get fired or relieved of duty, there's a whole bunch of administrative steps that go with that. And one of the things they do is they create a board to look back at your career and find out when was the last point in your career
Right.
performed honorably and with distinction. And
Right.
they may make you retire at a lower rank, which means a lot less pay, less benefits, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
So by voluntarily resigning, Dempsey really saved me what could have been a lot of pain.
Sure, sure. And how, what was your response to hearing? I'm sure you were, I mean, you said, hey, maybe I'm going to get fired, but you also thought walking into that meeting you might get promoted. So how did you respond to that news?
So when you're really manic, nothing seems bad. Everything seems
Oh,
good. You
okay.
see everything through rose-colored glasses because you're high on natural drugs. You're
Got
higher than you would be on cocaine or ecstasy. And so when General Dempsey said, hey, your time's done, I said, thank you, sir. That's great news. And I second hug. And I said, I know that God put me in this job to do his mission, his work. And now I'm being taken out. God's removing me. It's going to put me somewhere else, and I'm going to get an even bigger mission. And so I'm like, thank you.
Wow. Wow. How did your wife and family respond? And maybe it wasn't news to them. I'm wondering, behind the scenes, if your family was picking up on some of these signs. You'd kind of alluded to it, but can you talk a little bit more about, maybe what your family saw, or what the impact of your mania was on your family?
So with the firing, they were more disappointed than I was because I was, high as a kite. Although
Right.
happy high transformed over the next month or two into an angry, agitated rage directed against my workforce, who I no longer was in charge of. But the combination of getting fired, having these paranoid delusions, having 3 times in a row the doctors say there was nothing wrong with me, that all in my mind confirmed that I was the victim of an unfair, dishonorable coup by my
Right.
workforce. And so
Right.
my happy, jolly, euphoric mania turned into angry, rageful, bitter. So, but how did my wife was, pretty disappointed for me that my career would end that way. Um, but she was happy to be out of the craziness of National Defense University, which
Sure.
I saw as a really bad, backstabbing, swamp, with, just a snake pit where people were just out to protect their own turf and to hurt the boss, anybody that was trying to change anything. So she was glad to get out of that. She was happy that our retirement would be sped up, the less stress, retire from the Army, move on, do something different. So
Right.
happy. I think the kids were disappointed, because they liked seeing me in the Army. They knew I enjoyed my time as a Army officer, being in charge.
Sure.
Well, it was great experience. But they clear, in my book, there's an appendix, and I have family perspective. So my wife writes a
Oh,
piece
wow.
of each of my 3 sons write a piece. My mother, who was kind of through the whole thing, and then my sister-in-law. And they're really interesting to get their observations after the fact about what they saw, what they thought, what they felt about the whole thing. And so I think they all wish they had been able to connect the dots and see the evidence, but they couldn't, because, my wife Maggie put it really well. She, ever since she met me when we were in our early 20s, I was high energy, a lot of
Right.
drive,
Right.
actually fun loving, enthusiastic. And that's part of what she liked about me and married me for. And so she said I was like a frog in a pot of water, that a low light was put under it, and it gradually over decades got hotter and hotter and hotter, but I didn't see anything until the pot bubbled over. And
Right.
she would see individual events that she thought were pretty crazy or concerned her, but she couldn't put a pattern together. And
Right.
neither could the kids. There's no pattern.
Interesting. And I imagine with some of the mental health or the lack of diagnosis, you've gone to 3 different evaluations. You were basically told you've got a clean bill of health. I imagine that's supported. Well, maybe he's just stressed. These are high pressure, high visibility jobs. That close knife fighting that happens in the 5-sided building and things like that. I imagine, anybody could contribute it to something like that.
Absolutely. And it was just it. By the time I went over the top, off the tracks, crashed and burned, it was very late in my career. It was really the spring
Right.
in 2014. I had already had bipolar disorder for 11 years. And all the prior success, which not only was in spite of bipolar disorder, but largely because of it. And people don't realize that, a lot of the most successful artists, scientists, musicians, politicians, business leaders, and I would dare say military leaders, have benefited over the years from bipolar disorder. And it's not until they crash and burn, or they get quietly fired and they just go away, which is what the intent was with me. They just wanted
Right.
to get out of there, give me a soft landing, hope I went away quietly, and
Let's
never
avoid a scandal. Yep. Mhm.
all that kind of stuff. But I just was like, hey man, this is too important. I can't just sit there. I got to tell this bipolar story, because it's so important for so many millions and millions of people who are suffering from this, but who are ashamed and embarrassed and stigmatized. So
Yes.
that's some of the things that happened.
It's so critical. And to your points that it was a performance enhancer, I'm wondering if you have any ideas or recommendations about how the military can better balance that, the things we prize, like this person's got high energy, they're working nonstop, they're getting stuff done, they're, able to get stuff done on very little sleep. Yet we know that sleep is critical to health, mental health. We know that balance is really important. Um, is there a way to get the military to prioritize or to think about culture shift towards some of these things that maybe we undervalue or don't necessarily put a badge of honor on? This person got 8 hours, every day for the last however many months. Not just sleep, but some of those balance things that you talked about.
Yeah, I think it's part of educating the force about total health and fitness. And
Okay.
mental health is health. It's
Right.
not separate. It's all part of the same human body, and the brain is by far the most important organ in our bodies. And the brain, I would say, is the most important weapon system in the arsenal. It by
I
far.
love that.
And the brain is also the least understood of all the different parts of our body. So I would say the military for years and years has done a good job on physical fitness. We
Right.
run, lift weights, do push-ups, do
Right.
stretch, and we keep our bodies in pretty decent shape. And I think we've been teaching good nutrition and things like that. But I think we need to do a better job of really talking about brain health,
Mm,
mental, mental well-being in
right.
all the components of it. And the components are actually quite well known. You have to have healthful living. So to have a healthy brain and mental health, you have to, have a good, healthy diet. You should be
Mm,
getting 8 hours of sleep per night. You should be have a good exercise, PT, workout regime. You should, try to reduce stress as much as possible, but which is hard in the military, which is just by nature a stressful.
yes.
And everybody needs to understand this stuff. And you need to have a social platform where you've got people, a network of friends who are energizing and happy and who don't bring you down. You want to live in a place that kind of makes you happy and is energizing. And you have to have a purpose for your life, a
Right.
purpose mission, which, like for me, my life mission for all those years in the Army was, national defense, national security, leading. So,
Yes.
but all of those elements feed into and build mental health and mental wellness. So I think we need to teach it, and it needs to go all the way to the lowest level. And then we need to have what they're calling a peer support system, which in the old days they called it a battle buddy system, where you've got a trusted
Mm,
friend, a colleague, a sailor, soldier, airman, marine,
right.
your spouse, but a trusted person who knows you, who understands the tenets of mental health and healthy living, and then can see, hey man, how much sleep are you getting? It looks like you're only getting like 4 hours. You need to get 8 because we know that you need that. Hey, it looks like you're drinking a lot, like you're going out every night partying and
Right.
knocking. It's one thing to have, a beer or maybe two, but knocking down half a bottle of whiskey is something totally different. Or, taking illicit drugs, very, very bad for the brain and for mental health. In other things, somebody close, like a close battle buddy can see if someone is under a lot of stress, if they're starting to get agitated, angry, getting in fights and arguments, not keeping in touch with people
Right.
that care
Right.
about. And so a battle buddy or a close friend can see these signs and these trends and have a heart-to-heart conversation with the person. And then what has to happen is down at these lower levels, have mental health services and resources available that the service member can go talk to somebody who's a trained expert in this stuff
Mm,
without it being for attribution or without it being elevated up the chain of command. Because maybe all you need is just to get in and talk to somebody. Maybe your spending habits are really bad, or, there's some
Right.
leak going on in your life, or there's problems with relationships, boyfriend, girlfriend, and you could just talk to a counselor or a therapist and work through some of this stuff so it doesn't keep growing and turn into a crisis situation that then could lead to possible suicide and other things with the law. So those are some of the my thoughts that we could do better.
I love all of those, General Martin. Reminds me of some of the work that General Sims has done in terms of trying to get folks just access to the military family life counselors to just have a conversation. And I saw that, when I was an Army civilian, I used to do a lot of interviews with soldiers who had just come back from Iraq and Afghanistan, and a lot of them had experienced some traumatic events. And I'm not even a clinical psych, but some of them would say like, oh, I'm really glad we had this talk. Now I can go on leave and have a good time. Like, it was clear that sometimes people just need to unload. And so having those options, whether it's the MFLEX, whether it's chaplains, whether it's, licensed counselors, I think is so critical. And your other point about the brain being our most advanced weapon system, I love that analogy. Yet being the least understood, and just thinking how in the last 10 or so years, how much that science has evolved and how much more we know about the elasticity of the brain. You talked about how your bipolar, wasn't really triggered until your leadership in Iraq. So just thinking about, how sometimes we've got these genetic predispositions that don't really get turned on, that light switch doesn't get turned on sometimes until we have one of these significantly stressful experiences that then wakes up some of those genes in a negative way. So thanks for all those insights.
Yeah, one of the things you just said, just talking to somebody, I've got this thing called the 5 P's of recovery for mental health. And one of the P's is presence. And what it's really all about is being able to get outside of your own head when you have problems,
Yes.
think about your own thinking. And so a lot of times we catastrophize and we think these terrible thoughts, people are out to get us, when in fact it's stuff that's just in our own mind, our own
Right.
brain. And
Right.
a lot of times these bad things either aren't happening at all, or they're not nearly as bad as we think, or they can be resolved fairly easily if we talk to somebody and have an exchange. And I mean, really, that can, the so what of that is it can save your life.
That is spot on. I think about some of the conversations I've had with therapists. And I remember this one therapist told me, because I'm one to like ruminate in the evenings, especially, which is not a great recipe for sleep. And so I remember this therapist saying, your mind is like a rough neighborhood. You shouldn't go in there at night, and you shouldn't go in alone. And that's always stuck with me in terms of just having that sounding board sometimes, somebody who you can just say, hey, I'm feeling this way, and have it be a judgment-free zone. Your focus on peers, I think, and having somebody who really knows your behavior and can identify some of those changes um, is huge. I know that it reminded me of some of the work that the New York Fire Department did after 9/11 and standing up a peer counseling network, just because the tragedy was so enormous, and just so many of the stressful outcomes that came from that experience, and the benefit of peers who really have been in it and understand that environment is so critical. I'm wondering if you have recommendations for how the military can better support senior leaders. So thinking about some of the challenges in terms of your experience with um, the mental health professionals you met with, and not getting that diagnosis. Is your sense that there's a culture where folks want to just kind of patch things up and get people back to duty as quickly as possible? Do you think your experience was more about being a senior leader and not wanting to, negatively impact your career? Any thoughts you have on that?
I have a few thoughts. First off, I think senior leaders, and I'm going to say '06, colonel or Navy captain, on up through the general officer, admiral ranks, they should have a 360-degree peer rating system that is actually done to standard properly. Everybody understands what's going on. So I think that as a senior leader, if you get honest, candid input from subordinates, peers, and superior,
Mm,
you're going to have a lot more self-awareness, and people are going to pick up on a lot of, any troubling, maybe dangerous behaviors that you have.
sure.
Like when I was a flag officer and a colonel, the only people who gave me any formal input at all were my superiors. And they see you not that often, and they see you from very different perspective than subordinates do. And so I think that would have been
Right.
very, very helpful. The second thing is, as you get higher in rank, you become more and more alone. I mean,
Mm,
you go into these bigger organizations, you're the commander, and you really don't have any peers. There aren't any. It's just you and a boss. I
right.
think that the military would be wise to assign a battle buddy or figure out some kind of way to have a peer support program for flag officers and probably '06s. And I think that would be very, very beneficial. Just like a private has a battle buddy that can be
Right.
very, that they trust. So could a 2-star general or a 4-star
Right.
general have a
Right.
battle. Um, the third thing I think would be really good is the corporate world. In some of the big government agencies, they have a formal coaching program where they hire professional coaches who have been to school, have been trained and certified on how to be a executive coach. I think we should figure out a way in the budget to assign a professional coach. And so for the military coaches, most of them are retired flag officers who had really good career, who have vast experience, who really understand leadership and what the military is like. And then they go back to school and they get certified, and they are basically a coach. And, we've got a model for that. The observer controllers, if you look at these big exercises that all the services do, they call them graybeards, and they all assign a graybeard to the commanders that are undergoing these exercises. So if you like the military, I don't know if they used to call them battle command training program in the Army, big computerized war game.
Yes.
Everybody from 1-star up would have a graybeard who would shadow them and give them advice and coaching and critiques all the way through the exercise. I mean, I think we could do something like that.
I love that. I love all of those ideas. We're getting some questions here about the 5 Ps that you mentioned. So one was presence and getting out of your own head. Can you mention what those other 5 Ps are?
Yeah. So I wrote an article. It's in Psychology, no, Psychiatric Times. It came out
Yeah.
last summer, and it's called the 4 Ps of mental recovery. So after I wrote the article, my son convinced me to put a 5th P in. So it went from 4 to 5. But the 5 Ps are: how do you recover from mental illness? Number one, you have to have the right brain chemistry, which often, like for me, required medication. I had to have lithium, or my biochemistry wouldn't allow me to recover. Number two, we have to have healthful living, which I talked about: diet, exercise, sleep, low stress. And then that needs to be anchored into the social platform of the 5 Ps. And the 5 Ps are people, having a network of
Mm,
who are happy, energetic, fun to be around. So that's the first P. Place, live in a place that energizes you, makes you happy, enables you to do things you want to do. Third P is purpose. carve out for yourself your own mission that you're passionate about, that serves a greater cause, that serves other people. And so for me, my purpose is sharing my bipolar story to help stop the stigma, alleviate suffering, and save lives. I mean, that's what I
Love
do.
that.
I
Yeah.
mean, that's my job 7 days a week. I mean, that's why I'm talking to you. That's why I wrote a book. I write articles. I give talks. And then the fourth P is perseverance. You got to have willpower. I mean, willpower can't fix your brain, but without willpower, there's a good chance you're not going to recover because there is an element of willpower, character, perseverance. So that's the fourth one. And then the fifth is presence, this ability to get outside of your own head, to think about your own thinking, because we know that all these problems that are tying our brains in knots probably aren't problems at all, and we can probably solve them if we talk to the right people. And just a little bit on the people part, we moved to Cocoa Beach, didn't know anybody, got a fantastic network of friends from the gym, from church, from neighborhood. In fact, my best group of friends are a bunch of women about my age, and we dance 4 days a week, and I have a blast, and I'm the only
Love
guy.
it. I love it.
And then Cocoa Beach is a great place to live. So those are the 5 Ps.
So there's a couple that you highlighted that I wanted to hone in on, and I think purpose. I think it's clear from anybody who knows you, even just for 5 minutes, that you lead your life with incredible purpose. For those on this webinar, because I'm shameless, I reached out to General Martin. I don't know, it was over a year, probably a couple of years ago now, on LinkedIn, and said, hey, I know you don't know me, but I read your article about your experience with bipolar and I'd be really interested. Immediate response, let's chat. And just, I so appreciate how open you are with your experience, because I think it's a game changer. The other thing, in purpose, I'm wondering if there's, we often talk about these aspects of resilience. So the, mental, physical health, emotional health, social connections, you mentioned people, but then this other piece of spiritual health, you had mentioned that you were very religious, had kind of become really extremely religious, and that being one of the signs of bipolar. I'm probably not articulating that well. But I'm wondering if you can talk at all about if there was a spiritual journey as you started recovery, what that has been like for you.
Yeah. So in my life, I grew up as a cradle Catholic, but I wasn't particularly religious, but I was spiritual. I mean, I thought about, eternal things and what's the purpose and
Sure.
how do I make a difference? And then I had an intense religious experience when I was a freshman in college, and really became it was a conversion and became a born again Christian. And that was profound. I started memorizing Bible verses, going to church, all kinds of things. And they made, those power verses from the Bible, they carried me through some really hard times, like in
Wow.
combat, when I had to make tough life and death decisions, and key verses would go through my mind. And then when I went into full-blown mania, I had a symptom called religiosity, where my religiousness went to extremes, to excesses. It was, out of control. I mean, I was doing 20, and this is when I was, in intense mania, doing 25, 30 religious events per week, leading multiple
Wow.
Bible. He's going to 4 or 5 church services on a weekend, having hallucinations of seeing the Holy Spirit, hallucinations of seeing demons attacking our house, putting little Bibles and crucifixes and crosses
Wow.
all the windows. And so that all went away when I went into depression. It just stopped. When I went into depression, all that religiosity and religion just whoom, went
Wow.
away completely.
Wow.
When I started to recover, I said, I really want to make an effort. And I would pray every night, that, for recovery, and, that I could have a good, meaningful life. But I mean, I was dead spiritually for a few years. And when I moved to Florida, I said, I want to rejuvenate my spiritual life. And so I started
Sure.
church again, got back into, one, not five Bible studies, tried to pray and meditate every day. And the meditation was a big part of it. And so I did that. But then I got this purpose of sharing my bipolar story, which I'm doing today. It became so huge that I prayed about it. I talked to kind of, spiritual mentors and said, hey, I think this is my life mission. And, in the Bible, it says, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor, other people, as yourself.
Mm,
And I said, hey, this whole thing with bipolar is all about helping other people. And so this is
right.
my act out my faith, my belief to help other people suffering with mental illness and bipolar. So this, and I don't know whether this is totally good or if there's a little bad to it, but this mission with bipolar disorder has become my life purpose. And it's almost like my religion.
Right. Right.
How when I was an army officer, my religion, even though I was Christian and went to church and prayed, read the Bible, my religion was army. I lived, ate, slept, breathed U.S. Army. That's what I was. It was my whole identity. And now it's kind of like it shifted to, the name of my book is Bipolar General, my
Right.
forever with mental illness. So my identity is now all wrapped up in bipolar disorder, mental illness. I probably need to get some counseling. Maybe we could talk in the chat whether I'm too intense on this.
No, I love it. Well, we're very appreciative, sir. And you've got a number of Army friends on here. I'm glad that we closed chat to folks because I see a lot of beat Navy comments in these questions. We've got some folks on here saying, fond memories of your politics of defense policy class. So yeah, a lot of folks who are living, breathing military careers, but I, there's also a lot of folks on here thanking you for your story. We have about 15 minutes left, and I wanted to, one of the areas that we didn't discuss is around your recovery and how, eventually you did get into the VA. I think when you were deep in the psychosis state, can you talk a little bit about what your recovery was like and what you do to I guess sustain recovery because it is a lifelong process?
Yes. So in November 2014, when I had crashed into depression, I went back for the fourth time to Walter Reed. The first three times they said fit for duty, nothing wrong. And
Right.
the fourth time they said, aha, you are depressed, General Martin. And then they looked through their notes and they remembered the little comment that my wife made about mania. And they said, aha, we had a little conversation. They said, you have bipolar disorder type 1, which means mostly mania, some depression. Type 2 is mostly depression, some mania. And I said, okay, I believe you because I know there's something wrong. I
Right.
want to recover. So I'm counting on you guys to help me recover. And it was really 2 full years of what I call bipolar hell, where I had hopeless, dark, you know, suicidal depression, terrible psychosis. It was terrifying. And so I wanted to get better, but they never got the medication right. They tried a bunch of different drugs. None of them worked for me. I probably needed inpatient. They never gave me inpatient. Um, I retired from the Army and I went out the door with no continuity of care plan, which is terrible. Well, I mean, what a horrible mistake. Before I left active duty, there should have been an airtight plan to hand me off to either a civilian provider or to the VA. Should have happened. So the day I left active duty, retired, I mean, the next day I should have been reporting to a VA and they would have brought me in and treated me.
And just to interrupt real quick, sir, do you think you were not brought in because at that point they hadn't diagnosed you, or you were diagnosed at this point, but there was not a continuity of care in place?
They had already diagnosed me, but they just didn't exercise a continuity of care.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Why they didn't do it, I have no idea.
Okay.
I think it's now mandatory for
Got
people
it.
leaving the military with any form of, mental illness. Um,
Right.
and so I moved up to New Hampshire, and I went from bad to worse, just
Mhm.
awful. And finally, it was March of 2016, through a battle buddy, a really dear friend who stuck with me through thick and thin. He never gave up. When I wouldn't answer his emails, his texts, his phone calls, because I was so depressed, he would get a hold of my wife, Maggie, and
Wow.
together they got me into a VA, a nearby VA. And as soon as I went in and we started talking about, they always ask you these questions. They say, when you go to see a psychiatrist, they say, "Are you suicidal?" No. Do you have more? Do you think about hurting others? No. And this guy at the VA in Vermont said, "Do you have any morbid thoughts of death or dying?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Okay, tell me about them." And I said, "I have terrible thoughts that I'm going to get arrested, imprisoned, beat to death, murdered in jail, and die gurgling in a pool of my own blood. And it goes through my brain 24 hours a
Right.
day." And then I
Right.
have another one where I'm walking along a road or driving a car, and this invisible force grabs me and either steers me head on into a truck and I get smashed, torn apart, or he throws me under the wheels of a truck. And so, what the psychiatrist at the VA said is those are passive suicidal ideations. So, you're
Mhm.
not actively thinking about killing yourself,
Right.
but passive ideations can easily and quickly morph into active, and then you can kill yourself. And so he said, "We need to put you in the inpatient facility." So I did that for a couple of weeks, and that was very helpful, but it didn't turn me around. It wasn't until I took lithium that I actually got on the road to recovery. And then it was like I talked about before, medication, therapy, healthy living. And then I learned about the 5 Ps about a year ago.
Right.
Uh, and it's a never ending journey. It's a forever war, which is why I put that in the title of the book. It, you know, Bipolar is never going to leave my brain. It's always in there, lurking,
Right.
bring back into action if I let it, or I get sloppy. Like if I don't get enough sleep, if I start too much stress, it'll come back. So it's a lifelong process. It's like managing diabetes. You
Right.
take medicine and manage it for the rest of your life. And if you do it properly, you can live a happy, healthy, purposeful life.
I love that. And your point about managing to prevent relapse, you've talked a lot about, living a healthy life from exercise, surrounding yourself with a network of social support, eating healthy. Are there other things you do to try to prevent relapse and ensure that you can continue on this road to recovery?
I pretty much religiously get 8 hours of sleep a night,
Okay.
and I try to take some kind of a nap in the afternoon. I work out a lot. I really do work out. I really try to make social time with my friends and get together and just have fun and laugh and visit with each other and dance to music that I really like. I try to really make time for my wife. So we try to go on beach walks together, bike rides, take classes at the gym. In the evenings, we try to watch like a fun series to watch or a movie. So I'm like relaxing. I'm not doing my bipolar work. I'm not doing my book work. I'm
Right.
hanging with her, and then we have something fun to talk about. And I try to keep in touch with the kids and our grandson. And so those are kind of the key ones.
Got it. Those are great examples. And I'm wondering if you have any advice in the Department of the Navy and DoD, we keep talking about prioritizing and normalizing mental health in the same way we do physical health. I'm wondering if you have any advice on how we can have more open and honest communications about mental health, if you've got any recommendations or suggestions based on your experience.
Well, I think what you're doing today is a great example of, what right looks like. I mean, you have somebody who has credibility with the military. As I
Right,
was, I underwent severe, severe mental illness that could easily have killed me. It's pretty dramatic. I got fired from my job. I had forced to retire, mandatory inpatient in a hospital. And you guys you've really set up an excellent program with, good questions. You've set the conditions with the flyer ahead of time. You've brought in a really vast audience. I would say keep doing things like that. I would say the other services should copy and replicate what the Navy is doing. So, I mean, your model is excellent. Now, other services, I encourage you to do the same thing. And
right,
all systems in the US military. I mean, the military has the most extensive school system in the world. All of those
right,
schools, Sergeant Major's Academy to the captains and the flag officers and the privates, they should all be getting some sort of training and education that again normalizes all of this thing. And I can give names of people who would be excellent speakers who could, do a fantastic job,
wonderful.
pass those on. And then I would just say, anybody out there, if I would be happy to do this same type of forum presentation, whatever, for your command, your organization, your group, your book club, your whatever. Just get a hold of me. My email's on the thing. I've got a website. Just look it up and invite me, and I'll do everything I can to do the same thing with your team.
Thank you so much, sir. That is such a gracious offer and no doubt impactful, your story. It looks like we've got time for one more question. Actually, I'm going to try to slip in two just because I'm ambitious. Uh, if you suspect or feel that somebody may be struggling with some kind of mental health condition, what should you do? What do you recommend?
I would recommend talking to the person saying, hey, we're friends, we're colleagues, we're battle buddies. I've I've been noticing things in your behavior, your attitudes, the way you're acting, and some of them concern me. And
Right,
here are some of the things I'm seeing. I mean, you're really drinking a lot. You seem very agitated and angry. You've been getting in fights. You're doing, you're worried and stressing out in ways I never saw before. Um,
right.
they might be having legal problems. They may be having relationship problems. They may be having financial problems. Just get it out there on the table and say, hey, I'm your friend. I'm not accusing you. I want to help you. What do you think? Is there something, can we talk about this? And there are resources to help you to deal with all of these problems. You're not in this alone. You're not.
Yes.
And I would just start the conversation in a caring, loving, trustful way. And
Right.
the biggest factor in having success in these conversations is having a trustful relationship. So if there's no trust to begin with, it's probably going to be an uphill struggle. But if
Right.
you trust and they trust you, then they're probably going to respond in a positive way.
Yeah, that's such a great point. And sometimes it's just having that initial conversation to get the ball rolling. Last question. What do you think is the most important thing you would want this audience? And we've got between the phone and participants on the line, we probably have about 400 people on listening to this. What is the biggest takeaway from our conversation today?
The biggest takeaway is mental illness, bipolar disorder can strike anybody. It can hit any one of you folks out there in the audience. I mean, it hit me when I was in my late 40s. It hits most people in their, teens to early 20s. But it can hit anybody, and it doesn't care what your race is, if you're gay or straight, what your religion is, what your finances are. It can hit you, and when it does, it can left untreated destroy you. Or
Yes.
the other alternative is you go get medical help, you see a psychiatrist, a therapist, you start doing the things we talked about, get the medication straight, the healthful living, the 5 Ps, and you can live a wonderful, healthy, happy, purposeful life, which, I'm really an example of. And I think that's the biggest bottom line takeaway. And I really applaud everybody for signing on for this, because this stuff that I learned the hard way, that came close to killing me. And that would have been a shame. Then I wouldn't be here today. This information can save your life or the life of somebody you love.
Powerful words, sir. And I can't thank you enough for joining us today. Your story is so inspirational. We've had a number of folks in the Q&A comment thanking you for sharing that they've had their own family members who've struggled with bipolar or other illnesses, or teammates. And so the impact of your story is tremendous. Thank you so much for joining us. And thanks to everyone on the line who joined us today. I know we did not get to all of your questions, but tried to get through as many as we could. We will be coming out with a survey again, so if folks would answer that. And General Martin's book, Bipolar General, My Forever War with Mental Illness, will be going on sale. I think it's September 15th. Is that right, sir?
Yeah, it'll actually be in print on September 15th, and it's available on Amazon for pre-orders if anybody's interested.
Okay, wonderful. I know a number of folks have chimed in to ask about that. So thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you so much, sir. We really appreciate the time and just your inspirational story.
Jess, this was such a pleasure. I wish I could meet and see everybody out in the audience, but what you guys and gals are doing is so important. Defending our country. The military is a great place to serve and work and live. I love my time in the military, and I just really applaud every one of you. And if you have a follow-up question or it didn't get answered, you have my email. Just shoot me an email.
All right. Thank you so much, sir. Thanks everyone for joining. And until next time, have a great one.